the next stage is we're going to set out intermediate rafters which go between the tie beams, and these rafters will go right down onto the wall plate, and the top of the wall plate is shown on our tie beam at this point, because I said before we have a dovetail joint which will drop into this wall plate. And to set out these intermediate rafters, we're going to use a jig, and the jig is based on the peg that is securing the rafter. And we're going to bore a hole into the rafter, so when we've finished boring the hole, we can drop this rafter on top of that peg, which will secure it, and it will line up, this face will line up with that face, and it will reduce the error of setting out. It is important for a crown post roof that the collar, which we'll be setting out, has to be the same as the collar position we've already set out, so that the collar purlin will support the whole roof with no error. So we're going to mark the centre here with my pencil. We're going to turn it over. So this is the side of the rafter. We're now going to divide that the depth of the rafter in half. Go 10 and 5.
Right. It's possible.
10 and 5, there we go. We're going halfway through the depth, and we're going to mark it. We're now going to bore a hole through the side of the rafter, and it's going to be deeper than the protruding peg, approximately that deep. And this is where, on many medieval rafters, on a crown post roof, it has a rafter hole.
Does it look okay on your side?
Yeah, it needs to go over a bit.
Yeah.
That's it. A bit more. That's it. Lovely. We now have the rafter hole, as you can see, which is very common to see the rafter hole on medieval rafters. Only on the intermediate rafter, of course. We then insert the peg into the hole, turn the rafter up on its side, to me a bit, whoops. We can line it up, drop it in, mind your fingers, and in she goes. And there we have a nice flush finish on our rafter. Now we can then set out the top of the wall plate, which is that mark there, and we can see the wall plate on this side. There we can plumb up, form the shoulder where it goes into a mortise into the wall plate, and we can plumb that up. We need to level we need to level on our line, on our centre line. Cool, that's good, isn't it?
Oh, wow.
Yep, we've levelled up on the centre line, and any plumbing joints we do now will be correct.
Do we also plumb the apex?
Yeah, we're going to plumb up on the apex, and we're going to plumb up on our collar mark, and we're going to plumb up on the top of the wall plate. And now we're doing is setting out what we call the seat cut to go into the top of the tie beam. We will set out later the mortises to receive them, and we're going to set out the bridle joint here, and again I'll repeat, we're going to come up for the collar. Then we repeat the whole process again on this rafter. And all this work we're doing is all on the framing floor. This isn't done up onto the roof when you've got the wood plates high up. Everything on a timber frame building is all set out on the framing floor. So we've now completed the setting out of one of the rafters, and this will be repeated on the number of rafters that you've got going all the way through the building. Then that rafter will be numbered with the pair that we're going to do next. Then when they're assembled, very often on medieval houses, because they know that these are correct, they not necessarily always put in the right order. And it didn't need to be, as long as the pairs were correct. So you'll get a pair of rafters with the right numbers on, but wouldn't necessarily be consecutive. Shall we do another rafter?
You want to move this one out?
Yeah.
Nice.
So again, there's the peg, turn it over, and there's the rafter hole. We're now going to set out the next rafter.
You want to just put it on
Yeah.
the side?
Again, this is the other rafter for the pair of that one. We go through the same process again. We're going to mark the peg, just mark the centre there. Turn it over onto there. And we're going to bore the hole centre and repeat the same process as we did on that side. So this rafter will sit over top of this peg to complete the jig.
Let's really
Yep.
go down.
Yeah, I'll guide you. Yeah, that's okay, yeah.
What do you think?
That's okay, yeah. Well, I do. On a carpenter's framing floor, especially in medieval times, and I demonstrated the auger boring the holes, they would have employed many labourers doing all the boring work. The main master carpenter would do all the setting out, and then once the setting out is done, the ordinary carpenters would do the work of building the roof. We're now going to put this
What do you
onto the jig.
remember the trick?
You've got to mind your fingers.
Change the location of the peg.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, we wanted the opposite, sorry.
And it's so easy to line the peg up into the hole. And we have a nice flush Really good, isn't it?
Yeah. And
Then-
you've got the packers already.
Then we, as again, we just set out the foot of the common rafter, and we set out the apex, and we set out the colour. And then then once these marks have been set out, the apex joint will be cut, and the bridle joint will be cut. The same thing will be done on here. They will then be assembled back onto their pegs, and then the collar will be then fitted. Once that pair has been assembled, they'll be marked up and stacked on site. Ready, then you repeat the whole process again. You put a new set of rafters in, another collar, and the whole process is repeated. And because you're working to a peg in the side of the rafter, there's not going to be any error. Now, taking this a little bit further, while Victor's setting out that joint, on some medieval roofs, and quite common in Kent, or mainly more common in Sussex than Kent, the tie beam doesn't have a tie beam rafter. The tie beam sits on its own, and all the rafters are standard collar, the standard collar rafters which sit into the wall plate. And in this case, once this is set up, because we don't have the tie beam rafters, we set up what we're doing now using the wall plate, using the top of the wall plate on the dovetail joint, and we plumb up, we do the apex, and we put the collar in. Then because that then becomes a jig for all the other rafters, and then the rafter hole will be on the jig, not on the tie beam, because the tie beam doesn't have a peg. So you'll find that on the standard intermediate rafters, the peg hole will be higher than the tie beam. That's the only difference. Once this has been set out and assembled, and the collar in, that will then become the jig when the tie beam rafters don't go into the top of the tie beam.